and protected in this wonderful day, Spirit Week of Grace. I like to say giving thanks and not Thanksgiving, right? I did some research on that. I won't bore you with this, but they talk about how Thanksgiving is more geared towards the self and the person, sort of ranking all the things that they're grateful for that others have done for them, whether it be shelter, a roof over their head, and food and health. And giving thanks is more outward, right? Giving thanks to the Lord and others who sacrificed for us to have these things, right? So the week of giving thanks, right? However you want to spend it, but hope you're having a great week today. I want to talk a little bit about the low IQ of the races. What? The low IQ of the races? Races have low IQ. There was some research studies done on the IQ scores of people who hold really strong conservative and discriminatory beliefs against other racial groups. I'm going to get into some of this research, and there's also some research on, the positive end that I'll tap into. It's only fair to be balanced in this information. I'm also going to go into, can black and whites coexist? Can black and whites live together? Right? It's going on 2026, and black and white people are still not really getting along. Right? And America's a very interesting landscape because in every part of the country has its own little culture, right? Its own little subcultures and norms and rules. And, you guys took sociology. And it seems like in some parts of America, the black and white folks kind of get along, right? There's no sweat. Everything is all right. At least that's how it appears on the surface. And then you have some parts of the map, right? I'm out here on the West Coast. I grew up in the Midwest in Detroit, Michigan. Okay. I'm not going to say in Detroit, black and white people were holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but, you know, I grew up in an environment where it was predominantly African American. So I can't really say Detroit would be the best measure of black and white relations, you know. But I think the Midwest, though, Chicago, Ohio, places like that, it's fair. It's fair, but it's really hard to tell. Everybody kind of does their own thing. But California, the different cultural relations out here with the black folks, between the blacks and the Mexicans and the fucking blacks and the whites and the blacks and the Asians, is very different out here in the West Coast than where I grew up with in the Midwest. I've lived a little bit of a part of my life in Virginia, and I feel like it was a little bit more fair between the races, even in Virginia. But then you do have some parts, it's just really hard to really put a name on it. But California is very different, in terms of the different cultures and the races. And so I want to talk about, can black and white people live together? Is this something, the great American experiment, right? We can put all these races together and cultures together. Everybody can come over, come home, welcome home, right? But is that the reality that we're living in? So it says right here, what research says: lower cognitive ability, prejudice, and conservative ideology. There is empirical evidence linking lower general cognitive ability, often measured in childhood IQ or reasoning skills, to greater prejudice and racist or discriminatory attitudes in adulthood, right? For example, a large scale analysis, so they're doing studies on this, right, spanning data sets in the UK, found that lower childhood general intelligence predicted greater racial prejudice later in life. That relationship was mediated by endorsement of conservative or right-wing ideology and less intergroup contact. So if you were a child that grew up in an environment where maybe education wasn't really a value, right? Maybe the school system, the structures and the different systems, right? We have all these different political concepts. Maybe they weren't strengthened, right, for you as a child. Unfortunately, right? Children can't pick and choose their environments. But if that child grows up in an environment where education, intellect isn't sharpened, right? That iron sharpened iron, more than likely in later adulthood, they tend to fall into these more simpler, kind of rigid belief systems about other people, right? Researchers argue that individuals with lower abstract reasoning and cognitive flexibility tend towards simpler, more rigid worldviews, which map easily into look at me, authoritarian, conservative, or racially prejudiced ideologies. Importantly, this pattern persists even after controlling for socioeconomic status in education. So it's not simply less schooling equals more prejudice in the site of studies. Okay, well, belay my last, right? Even when they controlled for children who came from wealthier environments and who had the ideal structures and systems, right? So education is not always external, right? This suggests that for at least a portion of the population, lower cognitive ability or certain styles of cognition increases the risk of adopting prejudice, especially when combined with conservative or authoritarian ideology and limited exposure to racial or ethnic outgroups. Right? Actually, white folks, because you guys are the majority of the population, so I'm talking to you. Exposing your children and exposing your people to African Americans and I'm talking about black people. All right, control your ADHD. If you got ADHD and it's out of control, get the hell up out of here. All right, I did an ADHD video. Go pull that up. Exposing your children and your people to more African Americans actually helps you cognitively. It actually helps you, right? So the question of whether cognitive assessments or IQ tests or should be used to draw conclusions about racial groups is deeply controversial, right? And most reputable scholars caution that it's scientifically and ethically fraught, right? But that's not stopping people from doing these studies, right? So there have been historical attempts, right, the bell curve and other hereditarian leaning works to argue that average IQ differences between black and white populations are genetically determined. However, many psychologists and social scientists reject such conclusions. For example, adoption studies like Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study found that black or interracial children adopted by white families, right, raised in more advantaged, resource-rich environments, scored higher than national black averages, which suggests environment and upbringing significantly matter, right? Similarly, the IFERT study, children of black and white soldiers in post-war Germany, found that mixed race children's average IQ was very close to that of white children, right? The white children's was 97.2, mixed was 96.5, undermining simplistic claims of innate group differences. Many researchers conclude that differences in measured IQ between racial groups are more plausibly explained by social, environmental, educational, and structural factors, not by innate biologically fixed group differences. In short, using IQ to justify prejudice or segregation is scientifically unsound. And the strongest, more ethically grounded research points towards environmental inequality, not genetic race IQ gaps. So that people start to wake up a little bit like, hey, maybe guys, all this research that we did on black people being kind of innately ignorant and monkeys and animalistic, maybe that wasn't the best direction, guys. That ain't stopping people from doing this work, right? So, as the driver behind disparities in cognitive test performances, right? Recent data on racism, conservatism, and prejudice and what that means for coexistence. Newer research suggests that conservative ideology often mask or coexist with racial bias, even when expressed in seemingly race-neutral terms, i.e. opposition to diversity initiatives, DEI, or racial equity policies. A 2012 large-scale study concluded that lower general cognitive ability in childhood significantly predicts higher levels of racial prejudice in adulthood, right? Mediated by authoritarian conservative ideology and limited intergroup context. We talked about that. Yeah, you kind of see this in these little white kids, man. When you go to the park, I got my 1 year old, my 1.5 year old. I got, I live out here, in Orange County. It's a beautiful, beautiful neighborhood. And I just always felt uncomfortable, around these, really conservative white folks' children. I just don't feel fucking comfortable, and I got my daughter out there. She don't got, any children her age to play with. So I got to take her ass to the park, right? So when you got babies, black folks, you kind of forced into the shit. You guys know what the fuck I'm talking about, right? It's like, you're kind of like, damn, I just want to stay in the fucking house. Can I go somewhere where, I got people that get it, damn, we live out here in the fucking suburbs. I got to take my daughter out. I want her to grow up a fucking hermit. So, we go to these parks, man, and you could just see it in these white kids, and God bless them. God bless them, man. God bless the babies, man, because they don't know what the fuck is going on, right? A lot of it falls on you fucking parents. You have to answer that, to the Most High, right? Play with these children, right? You raise your children up in these really prejudiced, environments where they don't have any exposure to any diversity. You're talking all this shit, right, around about black folks and people of color in your house, and these children pick up on that, right? And I take my daughter to some of these parks, man. Those little white kids be looking at her like a damn alien, man. I feel so bad, man. So it puts you in such an awkward ass position as a black man, right? You're already black. People are already looking at your ass controversially, right? You got your baby out, right? You just want to take your daughter out, have a good time, just mind your fucking business, right? And these white kids, man, they're just so, they're not socialized, they don't know diversity, and it just feels so bad. My daughter was trying to play with him. They was playing, making like a little sand pizza. My daughter was trying to play with him. And I'm like, no, 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 which kids do, right? But some kids are more socialized, right? Not all kids act like that, when they get around other kids. Some kids are like, yeah, come play with us, come play. I've seen a lot of different types of kids, as a therapist. I work with a lot of different families, right? But it's just some white families, I just would rather not be around their fucking children. And it's not because of the children, it's because of these fucking parents, right? So it's just, it's some stuff to talk about in that area. So it is what it is. So what this research means in regards to black and white folks living together. When people claim their racist beliefs and conservative ideologies rooted in fear, ignorance, or rigid thinking, especially combined with a lack of exposure, research suggests that these beliefs are more psychological and social than genetic or natural. Low cognitive flexibility and authoritarian worldviews make prejudice more likely, but those traits are not determined by race. So that's enough of that. You know, can black and white people live together, right? Let's kind of go into this. I think this is really important to talk about because every time they do a Happy New Year, Happy New, I'm like, what's new? What's new? Right? Yeah, of course we can skin everything down to the individual, right? Maybe you quit eating certain foods, right? Maybe you went to the gym more, right? Maybe you fucking start writing in cursive. You use the right regular, you write in cursive, right? We can always make everything dependent on the cell, right? But collectively, what's new? You know, sure, you need to say Happy Old Year, right? Because a lot of it, this shit is just recycling. I never understood that. I guess it's New Year is only relative to the person. It's definitely not relative to the group because yes, we have made progress and changes and things like that as a people, but in some ways, it's like we're almost progressing back towards history, right? I'm not seeing enough new, right? What's new? A lot of times I don't even really celebrate New Year's. I'm like, what the fuck is new, man? You still out here fighting racism in 2025. We're still black folks are out here still being targeted, you know? And then you got black people who are standing up and fighting back, and now the white people are crying wolf, right? So it's just this shit, it's just cyclic. So can black and white people really live together? Right? Is it destined for us to really live together? Should we be in our own little fucking islands? What's that about? Let's look at it. So you grow up in a country that advertises itself as the great experiment, a place where races blend, cultures merge, and different people supposedly live together in harmony. But when you look beneath the slogans, beneath the patriotic language, you begin to see a far more uncomfortable truth. You see that America was not built for interracial coexistence. You discover that what you were taught about unity was often an aspiration, not a historical reality. And you start to understand that you are living inside systems that were designed long before you were even born. Systems that shape the way black and white people see each other, even when both groups genuinely want peace. You look at neighborhoods, school zones, and police patterns and realize you are not witnessing random outcomes. You are witnessing the residue of intentional, government sanctioned decisions that determined who belonged where, who got access to what, and who deserved protection. The American suburbs were never neutral. They were built on rules and ideologies designed to keep you separate from people who were categorized as threats. Those rules hardened into beliefs. Those beliefs hardened into culture. And that culture now shows up as preferences, comfort, or safety concerns. You are being shaped by historical architecture that has nothing to do with your personal morality, but everything to do with your inherited worldview. When you ask whether black and white people can truly live side by side, sharing streets, schools, parks, and property lines, you are not asking a simple social question. You are asking whether generations of segregation, policy manipulation, economic exclusion, and racial trauma can suddenly be undone by proximity alone. You are asking whether two groups who were deliberately conditioned to mistrust, fear, or avoid each other can genuinely build community without addressing the history that required them to live apart. You are asking whether wounds that were never treated can magically stop bleeding. And when you really look at the evidence, you realize the problem isn't about whether black and white people want to live together. The problem is that the structures around you were never built to support that level of coexistence. You are living inside the aftershock of redlining maps, racial covenants, discriminatory lending, police surveillance patterns, cultural propaganda, suburban isolation, and fragile interracial contact. You are living in a country where the consequences of intentional segregation are now being interpreted as natural differences between racial groups. This right now is the tension you are asked to navigate every day. This is so beautifully written, right? I love how that it broke that down. 15 deep points. Let's look back at the history of black folks being integrated back into society, right? Because for centuries, they weren't allowed to live amongst the white folks. So let's kind of look at how this thing kind of built up to where it is today. So when black veterans returned from war, America betrayed them. When you look at World War II, you see black men who fought for a country that refused to fight for them. You see soldiers returning home with uniforms, medals, and courage, only to be denied GI Bill benefits at rates far higher than white Americans. Research from historian Ira Katz Nelson reveals that up to 1 million black veterans were structurally prevented from accessing home loans, training programs, and education benefits that helped white veterans build the suburbs. You realize that early suburban wealth was fueled by white access, and black exclusion. And this exclusion wasn't accidental. Local banks, white real estate boards, and VA loan officers illegally denied black veterans mortgages in over 80% of American suburbs, despite federal law claiming to protect them. You begin to see how the foundation of modern American neighborhoods was built on rejecting the very black men who defended the nation. So, VA loan officers after World War II illegally denied black veterans mortgages in over 80% of American suburbs. So, the GI Bill became the first domino in multi generational wealth gap. You learned that by 1950, less than 2% of GI Bill home loans went to black veterans in many states. White families started building equity immediately, equity that turned into college tuition, inheritance, and safety nets. Black families were forced into overcrowded, resource starved urban districts, creating what sociologists call intergenerational economic divergence. You realize that this wasn't coincidence. It was a coordinated strategy that would determine which racial groups could accumulate wealth. This divergence created neighborhoods with dramatically different school funding, policing, and job access. You begin to see how the question of coexistence can't be divorced from the financial ecosystem that shapes where you live and who you live next to. You discover that the federal government literally drew red lines around black neighborhoods and coded them as hazardous or unsafe. The Homeowners Loan Corporation map classified black presence, regardless of income, as a financial risk. Between the 1930s and 1960s, banks denied mortgages in these areas at 10 times the rate of white neighborhoods. You start to understand that when white people grew up in neighborhoods without black families, it wasn't preference, it was federal design. You learn that millions of homes had racially restrictive covenants explicitly stating that the property could not be sold to black people. These covenants lasted into the 1960s and in some areas the 1970s. Even after they became illegal, white communities had already internalized the idea that black presence equaled decline. You realize that many white families today inherit not only the homes built, but the attitudes passed down like furniture that black people don't belong or they bring danger. This becomes the subconscious belief shaping modern coexistence. You discover that the 1968 Fair Housing Act did not magically open the suburbs. The Department of Housing and Urban Development found that real estate agents still steered black families away from white neighborhoods at rates exceeding 87% into the 1980s. You realize America stopped segregating on paper, but continued segregating in practice. When white homeowners protested integration with rallies, violence, and petitions, The message echoed across generations. Black presence equals threat. You see how this psychological conditioning still shapes neighborhood conflicts till this day. Every time black families moved into previously white neighborhoods, for example, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, white families left in mass. Sociologists estimate that the presence of just one black family could trigger up to 40% white flight within 5 years, from the 1950s to the 1970s. Just one black family moving into these dominant white communities triggered a 40% white flight. Y'all see this? So, what we're dealing with now started off federal practice, it started off policy, right? Then it became psychological, right? So, right now it's at the level of psyche, right? We're dealing with, population of white people who psychologically just cannot hold the idea of coexisting with African American families. And you always have your outliers, right? You always have, certain individuals like, I can live with black people, right? But we're talking about the majority here, right? Because this is a national issue. And if it's not addressed, spoke about, right, and really sort of, which you really can't really address it, because even at the psychological level, those strongholds, the only thing that can really alleviate that is, Jesus Christ, right, in scripture, because that's the only real medicine to a lot of these strongholds that go back generations and generations and generations. Because even at the level of counseling, some people don't even want to work with the black counselor, right? So this we're definitely in a psychological war now that was built on federal policy. So you begin to see that coexistence wasn't rejected at the individual level, it was rejected at the communal level. Developers like Levitt and Sons openly stated that their homes were for whites only. Levittown, New Jersey and Pennsylvania was 17,000 homes refused to sell to black families. These suburbs grew into generational enclaves where white Americans developed entire lives without ever encountering black neighbors. You realize that today's racial shock when whites encounter black neighbors comes from decades of isolation, not individual bigotry alone. Research shows that predominantly black neighborhoods experience policing rates 3 to 5 times higher, even when crime rates are comparable. Why? Because white communities have grown up insulated, interpreted black presence as suspicious or dangerous, and police departments follow complaint patterns, not crime patterns, right? And a lot of these white folks that go into the police force, that go into, being the sheriff, right? All these different sort of like power dynamics in these communities, right, are coming from these neighborhoods that were insulated, right? A lot of these sheriffs, and that's why a lot of these white boys are showing out in these police uniforms, right, with these illegal murders and crimes, because they grew up in these insulated ass white neighborhoods with no exposure to black folks, right? It's common sense to me. This creates the modern phenomenon of black men being reported for walking, driving, talking, or existing in white majority spaces. And I try to explain that shit to my wife, like, she's like, "Why are you not social? Why you don't go out and make friends? How the fuck am I gonna make friends in an area that generationally has intentionally and purposely kept black folks the fuck up out of here? You think I'm about to go run out? And I'm from Detroit. I'm not the black boy from fucking Hawaii. I'm from Detroit. I'm really proud of my culture. All right. I know my history. I'm not fucking ignorant. Right. And I can recognize people who are safe, right, as best as I can, right, who got using my discerning ability from my Holy Spirit. And I know people who are not. I'm called to guard my heart. All right. Because from out of it flows the issues of life. All right. So I'm not going to just throw myself out around people just because. That's not how it fucking works. Right. And sometimes it's hard to get when you're in an interracial relationship with these women coming from different countries. They don't know their history. They don't understand racial dynamics, right? And that shit was all created by these white folks. They know these people coming over here have strong prejudice against black people, and they look at the white people like God, right? And then when the black folks are responding and protecting themselves, the foreign women coming over here looking at you like you crazy, right? So they know what the fuck is going on. So you often hear about black crime, but not about white mobs burning black homes, bombing neighborhoods, or lynching integration leaders. From 1917 to 1951, there were over 50 major white race riots and community attacks meant to push black people out of white designated zones. Black resistance, self defense, community patrols, and armed protection was then mischaracterized as Black aggression, reversing cause and effect. You learn that when Black communities defended themselves, especially during riots instigated by white mobs, historians framed their resistance as the primary problem. This skewed narrative shaped modern stereotypes of Black danger and fueled white fears of coexisting with Black neighbors. You begin to understand that fear based racial narratives survive because they benefit the dominant group. School zoning tied public school funding to property taxes, ensuring Black neighborhoods received fewer resources. By 1970, majority Black schools had significantly fewer teachers, books, and materials, despite children living less than 2 miles from better funded white schools, right? And we talked about, and this goes for Black folks too, how when you grew up in an environment as a child where the educational resources and, yeah, controlling some variables, even if you had a great education, different things like that, you can still have these beliefs, which is in large part based off the education from your family, right? Because you got the school in the community and you got the school in your house, right? But Black folks is no different. If you grew up in an environment as a black child and you're not educated, you're not exposed to diversity, right? That puts fear into you wanting to work at jobs that are dominantly white, right? Going into companies where you could probably excel with your talents. But if you're surrounded by people you were never exposed to, there's a sense of intimidation there, right? If you're taught in your history, man, they burn down, your ancestors' communities and schools and different things like that, right? You're not going to be rushing into a lot of these white companies to try to get into the VP role, right? And the executive role, right? So there's a lot of psychological stuff that's happening too with African Americans that kind of become barriers for them getting jobs that could take their families to the next level and different things like that. If I'm my family dealt with years of discrimination, rioting, Black people, white people bombing our shit down. I'm not rushing to go get a job with white people. I'm not, right? I'm doing something more independent, right? Let me go be a rapper. Shit, let me go do something. You're in a really psychologically trapped space as an African American. Why am I so passionate talking about this? You guys are probably like, dang, why Randy always talking about black and white stuff? Because I was never taught this shit growing up. It wasn't discussed, right? And the trauma and the impact of being so uneducated about race in my home, it hit me so hard. But like brothers who I served with in the Marine Corps who knew the education, right? My brothers from the South who knew the history. It didn't sting them as much. But I was just like a damn fish out of water. I was like, what racism? What is this shit about? What they don't like us? What we do? What the fuck? It just system shocks you when you're not educated, right? So that's why I'm so passionate about teaching this. I was the one that was ignorant. I didn't know. And when I was exposed to it, it impacts you worse. So at least if you're educated, at least if you know as a young African American man, even older, when you're dealing with it kind of at least allows you more opportunity to live virtuously in the midst of this suffering, So this shit has to be talked about. It has to be discussed, right? And we have to put this knowledge and this information out there for our Black children, right? So that way we can prevent our Black men going to jail from showing out, right? Doing criminal behavior because they can't handle the sting, right? So they try to retaliate, they try to react. We educate them, we teach them, we can kind of normalize, right? Which it's sad that we have to normalize this reality, but you have to normalize this reality, all right? You have to be a fucking man. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to keep talking about this. Shit, man. You already got to go through so many obstacles and so many challenges just to win as a Black man in this country. Why not speak to that struggle? Why not validate other young Black men, young Black women, right? Come on, man. So studies from the 1940s through the 1970s show Black families paid up to 20% more for inferior housing because they had fewer options. Realtors and landlords exploited scarcity. This forced Black families into overcrowded areas, reinforcing stereotypes used to justify policing and surveillance. So these Black folks were forced into these ghettos, They were forced into these low economic environments where there were little resources. And today, it's so easy for the white folks to sit back and say, "Oh, you in the hood. Oh, you see how this shit works? How the history played into this and snowballed into this?" And now everybody's like, "Oh, them niggas are so violent there. You see how the devil worked?" And I don't think the devil is just a white man. It's a evil ass spirit, and it can use white people, right? Especially with the power that they're in. I'm gonna go after the people that's in power. I'm not gonna go after these weak niggas. What good is it using you? Yeah, I'm gonna use y'all too, but I'm gonna go for the power players, right? That's why we need Jesus. We need biblical wisdom and understanding. We need virtuous elders. We need leaders to undo some of these strongholds. We're not working hard enough. All right. Studies from the 1940s to the 1970s show black families paid up to 20% more just to live in a damn hood because they didn't have any options, right? Realtors and landlords exploited their poverty, right? This forced black families into overcrowded areas, reinforcing stereotypes used to justify policing and surveillance. The inequality became a loop. Restricted access equals poor infrastructure equals increased pricing or policing and further stigmatization. Police presence in black neighborhoods surged not because of crime, but because white communities demanded racial containment. In the 1960s, FBI memos and local police communications openly stated objectives to manage Negro movement, right? So the FBI was in on this, the police was in on this, and they still are. They still are. You start to see that present day police calls for trivial matters. Or you start to see present day police calls for trivial matters, barbecuing, jogging, knocking on doors. There's still this whole Karen movement. Is this shit? It's just a symptom of this programming and conditioning that's been going on for centuries, right? White Americans are statistically the most racially isolated group in the United States, with research from the Pew Research Center showing that 70% of whites, 75% of whites have no black friends, coworkers, or neighbors in 2025. 75%. 75% of whites have no black friends, coworkers, or neighbors. 75%. When someone grows up without exposure, they rely on media narratives, stereotypes, and inherited fears. Can you believe that 75% of whites have no black friends, coworkers, or neighbors? That's fucking ridiculous. You see that modern conflict isn't new tension, it's old isolation resurfacing. 75%. You realize the issue isn't whether black and white people can live or like each other. The issue is whether the systems, geography, culture, and inherited trauma of 400 years can be dismantled enough to make coexistence truly possible. You begin to understand that coexistence requires more than tolerance. It requires addressing the architecture that made racial separation the default. It requires confronting the myths white communities were taught, the trauma black community neighborhood line on the map. Yeah, man, I'm gonna keep talking about this, man. I hope I make you so uncomfortable that you get off your ass change. Right? This ain't the channel where you're gonna sit all fucking day. Right? I'm gonna speak to some of these real crucial issues that are going on that are just slowly but surely dividing us more and more every year. Right? Because I actually want there to be justice. I actually want us to make a difference and to unify and to do the right thing in the spirit of Christ and God's grace. All right. So I'm going to keep talking about it. All right. I'm out. Peace.